The Deep End team acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands on which we work and live, pays respect to elders past, present and future, and recognises the importance of Indigenous knowledge to informing public debate. Our guest today on The Deep End is Eddie Cubillo. Eddie Cubillo is an Aboriginal man of Larrakia, Wajigan and Central Arrernte descent, with strong family links into urban and rural areas of Australia's Northern Territory. Before gaining his PhD from the University of Technology, Sydney, he earned a Bachelor of Laws degree and was admitted to the Supreme Court of the Northern Territory. Before ATSIC was disbanded in 2005, he was elected chair to its regional council for the Darwin region. In 2010, he was appointed the Anti-Discrimination Commissioner of the Northern Territory and later became Executive Officer of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Legal Service. He is a former chair of NAJA, the North Australian Aboriginal Justice Agency, and the Aboriginal Justice Advisory Committee. He worked on the Royal Commission into the Protection and Detention of Children in the Northern Territory in 2017. He was named the 2016 National Indigenous Legal Professional of the Year and was a United Nations Indigenous Fellow in Geneva in 2016. At the University of Melbourne, Eddie is presently Director of the Indigenous Law and Justice Hub in the Melbourne Law School and a leader, alongside Associate Professor Shawana Andrews, of the Health and Justice theme in the Indigenous Knowledge Institute.
So Dr. Eddie Cubillo is a long-time human rights lawyer who was a Human Rights Commissioner in the Northern Territory. He also worked on the Deyell Royal Commission, and he is in the Melbourne Law School, where he established the Law and Justice Hub. So we're interviewing Eddie today about all sorts of things, but particularly his views on the impending referendum. So, Eddie.
Yes.
Tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Marcia and Aaron. I'm Larrakia, Wajigan and Central Arrernte man from the Northern Territory. I'm born and bred most of my life in Darwin, and my father lives in Alice Springs. And I did all my schooling and everything in the Northern Territory. So, you know, I have a big affiliation up there, obviously. And I've, in recent times, I've worked in South Australia for a few years. And then I went back, as you mentioned, I was the Anti-Discrimination Commissioner for a term. And I didn't extend my contract. I had issues with, you know, the whole gamut of the funding of the position and the office, as well as with all the, as you know, Marcia and Aaron, the plethora of issues around racism and, you know, social economic issues for our people. And this just wasn't real, to me, felt like it was a sort of a tokenistic role, and you know, our people in all jurisdictions up there had very little understanding of what the office was about, and it was very difficult to get that information out. And then I left and went to Brisbane to head up the National Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Legal Services for almost 6 years. And, you know, in that time, I, you know, went to the UN in regards to some of the concerns that were happening in the country. Also, you know, at one time there, the Liberal government thought it wise to withdraw funding of some 75% to the Aboriginal Legal Services, despite, you know, the statistics of the overrepresentation of our people across all the jurisdictions in the justice space. But fortunately for us, with all the advocating and also support, we, you know, it was one of the first times that we had the support of all people within the legal fraternity supporting that we get our money back. And then after my term there, I thought that I'd go and work on the Royal Commission with the in the Northern Territory on juvenile justice and child removal. That was for some 12 months, and that was a very tiring exercise. And as you're both aware, I heard many stories from our people on all the issues that that are facing our people, not only in incarceration, but one of the biggest issues facing our families is the child removal and the way that that's been done. Some 226 recommendations, and some 5.5, 6 years later, we have hardly any of those recommendations implemented. So, you know, if we going down that track of where we're going at the moment with a referendum for a voice, you know, it really underpins why we need a voice, Aaron and Marcia. And then finally, after the Royal Commission, I was pretty burnt out, and I didn't know what to do, and I just needed to. I was speaking with you know, counsellors about some of the stuff I heard, and it was really doing my head in. And then I thought maybe the possibility of doing some writing might assist me to get past some of the things I heard and that. And I ended up doing a PhD, and I ended up working part-time at the Melbourne Law School, and I'm here now as the director of the Indigenous Law and Justice Hub, and just recently walked away from the associate dean role.
So you have a particular theme in your career, and you know, I mean, I think it would be fair to say that you want to see parity for Indigenous people in incarceration rates, arrest and imprisonment rates for both adults and juveniles, in the removal of children from their families, and I don't know what to say about the juvenile detention system in the Northern Territory, because there's no point in talking about parity, because 100% of the children in the system are Aboriginal. Do you want to just expand on that for us, please, Eddie?
Yeah, I mean, that's been some time like that for a long time, Marcia. You know, as a kid growing up, I saw a lot of my family and friends in and out of that detention, and it was something that stuck with me most of my life. And you know, in the end, it was just pure luck. Sometimes I think that I didn't end up in that environment. Not that I was a bad kid or anything. It was just, you know, the system is stacked against you, and the biases that come in play with dealing with police and the law itself really captures our people, and it's really difficult for us to escape that vicious circle, Marcia. You know, I had kids at a young age as well, and you know, so it worries me now with my children having young kids, you know, that these things are worse than ever. And I think, you know, when I was a junior lawyer, I'd done a couple of years of practice, and I thought to myself at the time, the numbers in the Northern Territory was out of control, and I thought, you know what, I'll put my hand up and get on ATSIC at the time, the regional council. I'd get on and I'd, you know, just give some support to our regional council, and particularly around the law and justice space, to help to shape and implement our policies on what that would look like. And, you know, when I got elected to the council, and, you know, the thing about our regional council was that it was predominantly always been women, and so it just goes to show that Indigenous people ain't frightened to elect Indigenous women. And on our council, we had 9 women out of 13 members. So, you know, so predominantly a lot of our policies were about family and how do we look after that. And you know, the discussion around the voice, Marcia and Aaron, as you know, it's about trying to advise government on those things that, you know, work for our people and that our people will respect. And I think that's, you know, we developed law and justice policies, housing policies, and all that sort of advice to government. And I think, that since then, those things have sort of gone from bad to worse. And like when I look back now, Marcia and Aaron, when my time on ATSIC, there's a few things that I look back on on fondly, is that a few of the law and justice programs are still running that were initiatives and ideas from the regional council. So like the elders program in the prison, where we have elders going in, women and men, speaking to children and adults around the issues and getting them ready to when they head home, and the behavior that's necessary for when they go home. And I think those sort of things really highlight, that the voice is needed, because basically people outside of our communities really have no understanding of the issues that our people face. And working at a law school such as the Melbourne Law School, I see it firsthand with some of the most, well-read students in the country who have really no understanding of the issues facing the Indigenous people in this country.
So you served on the ATSIC Regional Council for the district around Darwin, and you say that the majority of the members were women, and they concentrated on family issues such as housing and how children are treated by the criminal justice system. What was the most successful endeavour of the Regional Council that you served on?
I think, like I said, the Elders program is still running, and then they had a whole heap of domestic violence programs that ATSIC used its understanding of the communities to develop those policies, but also backed it up with funding, with seed funding to show government that they work, and they still work, and governments, the Northern Territory governments, no longer mention that ATSIC was the organisation that built these programs, but the thing is that they are still there and they're working for our communities, and it gave voices to remote people living in remote areas and telling their stories about the differences and the need in their communities in comparison to, say, where I lived in the urban centre. And as we went on, Marcia, I think the other thing that is amiss from the demise of ATSIC is that you got the opportunity at the time. I was about 26 years old. I got opportunity to sit at a table and listen to my elders negotiating and discussing at a in a non-Indigenous way, but bringing an Indigenous perspective to the governing structure of that body, and it allowed us to really reinforce our practices. And as a young person, it gave me the understanding of how to respect and make sure that I'm listening and coming from an Indigenous perspective on developing these not only these policies, but also ensuring our laws and that are adhered to when we make these decisions, and that we are also respecting those people back out on our lands and that. So I think that's a miss at the moment, and we've got. I had the opportunity to work with some really, well-regarded Indigenous elders and who have since passed, but and not only in the Northern Territory perspective, I also got the opportunity because of it to see how others in other jurisdictions work in that sort of space, and it really gave me an opportunity to build my understanding of an Indigenous type governance and respect for where we all come from and the differences between us in regards due to colonisation and that.
I'm very glad you raised ATSIC and your journey through it, Eddie, because it's occurred to me for quite a while that despite
Prime Minister Howard's quite opportunistic maligning of ATSIC towards the end of its existence, it did a very good job for a very good time. It gave that proportional representation that you're talking about. It provided advice to government that was sane, sensible and achievable. And it also helped train leaders as independents who were elected by their communities to represent them. And we haven't had that since ATSIC was dissolved. People in Indigenous communities have actually been robbed of that kind of leadership training by the lack of a democratic system for electing such representatives. It's clear to me that we just need that back. It's a no-brainer.
Also, Aaron, I think it's a two-way learning, right? I thought it gave the opportunity for non-Indigenous people to really have an understanding of the practices and the thought processes that our people have to do to make a decision, right? There are some things in the background that we need to go and make sure that it meets the requirements of our communities, and that rather than just a decision off the cuff without having that respect for our practices. And I think that historical knowledge and that two-way learning between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people has been lost, and we have this through the Howard government at the time that decisions were made in these departments rather than with and alongside Indigenous communities. And I think that is also a huge loss. And I look back on that, and I think some of the non-Indigenous staff that worked in these organisations were around for a long time and had a real good understanding of the issues and how our governance practices worked. But also, so I was in, like I said, I was in the regional council in Darwin, and that's where the head office was. The other side of it was that 85% of the people in that department of ATSIC at the time were majority were Indigenous, and they weren't just in the lower admin roles. Most of the roles in the managerial roles were all filled by Indigenous peoples, and I think that also in itself made it easier when you were discussing the importance of certain decisions, as well as having an understanding of the environment that our people are coming from, and relaying that back to the decision-making process to government. So I think there's this whole loss of that that we're not talking about when we discuss the need for a voice, right? There's this whole educated process that's gone by the wayside without really thinking it through.
I can remember being all throughout Arnhem Land and communities and following local festivals and working in local radio stations with local broadcasters. People you probably heard on, Tiba radio growing up as a kid, for example, all throughout the 1990s and the early aughties. And, look, you'd probably be remiss to say that those communities were a utopia. They certainly weren't, and there was certainly a lot of disadvantage and poverty. But my sense of people who were in positions of local trust and authority and doing good things for their communities, whether it be in those sorts of, broadcasting or art services I was talking about before, or in health or in education, didn't really necessarily see themselves as disadvantaged, because there was a high degree of autonomy in how they were allowed to conduct their business and make decisions at local levels to meet local needs. And they had really quite immediate control over that back then. And then it suddenly, very sadly, about 15 or so years ago, all disappeared.
Yeah, you're right, Aaron. Like, I'm probably showing my age, but like BRACS, CDP, all these sort of programs were, they weren't perfect, but people had things to do and develop and real were driven by the community. And I think, you know, once we withdraw all those, there's not much for people in communities to aspire to or look to. And, you know, so also ATSIC did was people say like the likes of Terry Janke and Megan Davis, myself and others, through some shape or form, we were given opportunities because of ATSIC.
Yeah.
And that really shaped us and our thinking on regards to where the possibilities we can go, but not also the opportunities to work in environments that you can't get now. So I think, you know, those are some of the things we ain't talking about when we talk about the voice. You know, we're getting lost in the Constitution. That's a very small part of it, and I don't really want to discuss that. That's been done to death. But what hasn't been done to death is all these practical things that ATSIC or a voice, a representative body will bring. And I think those are some of the real things that people out in communities, and I'm not talking about our communities, I'm talking about the non-Indigenous community, to really get their head across, because there's a real, we look at all the statistics now, you know, not only in the justice, but we look in the health and even the education and everything. They're not really great, and some of them are going backwards each year. So I think those are some of the things that we need to improve on as a nation. And I think, you know, if we go back to ATSIC, when I was there, it was the last term, and there was a review done on ATSIC, and we participated because it's good business sense, right? That after 10 years, you should review your organisation to make sure that it's working properly, and if there's things to need to look at to fix. And we participated, and we gave evidence to that review in the hope that we shape this body that will go on and become bigger and better than what it already was. But they didn't even, again, this is what happens when you don't have a voice. They didn't even accept their own review, which said to keep ATSIC but make some adjustments to the current structure, and it was just thrown out. And I think that's really underpins why we need a voice giving government good advice.
I can, you know, remember vividly the slide from that scenario in the 1990s that I was reminiscing about before, and what I see now is the, you know, massive encroachment of devastating poverty that just did not exist back then. Like the level of poverty, which of course feeds into all those other things you're talking about in the justice realm, in youth detention and incarceration, is just crippling. I mean, you know, there are families in the kinds of communities we've been talking about that are running out of money for food on day 8 of the pay cycle, if they're lucky, and they're already mostly subsisting on 2-minute noodles. This is not acceptable in a nation like Australia, from my perspective. And I'm sure you've seen similar things.
I look, I was the Anti-Discrimination Commissioner, and you know, our people on communities, as you are both aware of, can speak up to 5 different dialects, and English, not one of them. And you know, just to get information flow and understanding around the constant changes to laws and that is difficult and hard to do. And so, you know, when you don't have this information flow back and forth, basic little things people are not aware of, and it causes all sorts of issues.
Yeah.
And so it's really a worry. And look, I'm not saying the voice will fix everything, but if we look at it where we are at the moment, it's pretty disgusting, the statistics, right? And
oh, they are.
As a nation, we should be ashamed of that. And you know, every time there's a universal periodical review from the UN, Australia gets a hiding around its treatment of our Indigenous peoples, but we don't ever seem to want to implement those recommendations and make significant change. And we need a body that basically keeps them accountable and continues to inform the wider community of the issues that are concerning our people and the lack of respect from governments to make sure that they uphold their side of the bargain as well.
One of the excuses I often hear, even before this referendum debate started, about why things have deteriorated so badly is people will say, oh, well, look, Australia's just so big, it's just not possible to, provide that level of service across such a huge landmass. And, of course, it's such a flawed argument because, as you've quite astutely pointed out, we did used to do that. Like we were doing it 30 years ago. And again, not perfect, but actually relatively successful and somewhat satisfying.
Yep.
Yeah. As for the incarceration statistics and youth detention statistics, I've found myself saying this in various public forums that I've spoken at about the referendum. If the 100% youth detention rate in the Northern Territory is not enough to compel Australians to vote yes in this referendum, then I'm not really sure what more we can say. It's an outrageous human rights abuse, and it's often said, isn't it, Eddie, that Indigenous Australians are statistically the most incarcerated people in the world. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't want to move away from it, Aaron, but the reality is that our organisations, our community control organisations, whether it be in law and justice or health, are all are screaming about the statistics. Our out-of-home care statistics is probably the worst out of all of them, and our organisations are, fighting and making sure that things are trying to be better. But the reality is, it's since the apology from former Prime Minister Rudd, things are like 3 or 4 times worse than they've ever been. And the research says if you're on out-of-home care orders, you're going to end up on dual orders and have juvenile justice orders as well. So we're just not listening to the research, and we're making policy on the run, and we're continuously our biases are playing into this, and unfortunately Indigenous people are at the forefront of the punishment. And despite, and as Marcia's worked on them, so has I, on royal commissions, and all the recommendations that have been given in these inquiries, royal commissions and coronials, they're just all being ignored. And again, when we did have ASIC, we had some accountability around making sure that states and territories were adhering to some of the recommendations on the deaths in custody. So I just think, seriously, in regards to our, statistics in those areas, we really do need a voice giving government better advice than what they've been getting.
As you say that, it also reminds me of something that Barry Jones mentioned to us offline. I think it was Barry Jones, that there's been also a simultaneous erosion of the independence of public servants as well, that in the past, public servants were effectively there for life and were effectively, in a position where they, really couldn't be removed. But that spin cycle we see of people coming in and out of communities and roles and agencies and constantly changing all the time, it seems that lack of continuity feeds into this overarching confusion and, I guess, lack of direction as well.
Like I said, I recently worked on a Royal Commission, and it was a short Royal Commission, initially only 6 weeks. I don't know, and I was asked to join, and sorry, it was 6 months initially, and I said, "Oh, look, I don't think we're going to do. We won't even get staff within 6 months."
Yeah,
and I just kept getting badgered to join, and I wanted to go home and help up home, and so eventually I gave in and went back, and because we couldn't, there's a lot of people on the Royal Commission from the Attorney General's Department, due to the fact that the time frame was so short, and we needed to get people in there working. And look, after hours in the discussion with some of these people, that'd let you know that to go and work in the law and justice space and Indigenous in the Attorney General's Department, the common discussion was that that's where your career would go to die.
I've heard that too.
So despite, and previously, growing up and working in this space as a young lawyer and advocate, and as you spoke, there was historically knowledge of people who had worked in that space for a long time and liked working in that space, and was able to, historically knew everything about whether the ALS and the previous policies and everything. But there was this whole big thought process that your career went there to die. And I think that's what happened with the mainstreaming and all of that. That law and justice was ripped out of ATSIC and all of this sort of thing, and so there was a big loss of historical knowledge from the public sector, and there's a high turnover now in some of these departments that don't help the cause of what we're trying to do. But I think, again, like, if we're going to go back to ATSIC and a voice, I think that would really assist in giving direction on what works and what doesn't, and how to go about engaging with our communities and making sure that the right people are being heard and decisions are making for the right lands and the right groups and everything like that. There's this just misunderstanding of that you can just go in the community and speak to anyone and get an outcome.
That's one of the things I'm very concerned about, Eddie. I worked with Professor Tom Calmer on the voice co-design process, and we produced 2 reports which were presented by Ken Wyatt when he was Minister in the Morrison government to Cabinet. Peter Dutton was in the Cabinet both times that we presented our interim report and then our final report. And we made very strong recommendations about local and regional voices. But unlike ATSIC, what we recommended was that the voice structure that we proposed have no funding and program responsibilities, but rather only advisory. But we recommended up to 35 local and regional voices. And in the national voice design, we recommended an additional 5 seats for remote areas, so that they would be overrepresented in the national voice precisely because of the extreme disadvantage in the very remote areas. But I think what has happened, if you're paying attention to this referendum, perhaps you've tuned out, but I haven't. What has happened, I've observed, is that in the last 15 to 20 years, the Conservative side of politics has been very clever at convincing Australians that we're not disadvantaged. And so if you're following the referendum, you'll see that it's very easy for the No campaign to play into the false belief out there in Middle Australia that Aborigines don't suffer any disadvantages. And of course, Senator Price and Warren Mundine have both contributed to this view as well by arguing that colonialism was good for us because now we've got running water. Well, you and I know that the majority of our communities don't have drinkable water. So I don't know what she's talking about. But I think whereas once upon a time Australians did understand the extent of the disadvantage in many of our communities, now they simply don't understand at all. And we can cite the Closing the Gap statistics at them till we turn black in the face, but it simply has no impact because psychologically they're tuned into the picture of Aborigines on mainstream television who, are usually, fairly well dressed, living in cities, very articulate. And they say, well, what are they whinging about? What disadvantage? So there's this huge gap between the reality and what Australians think is going on. And I think we've lost the war by not communicating accurately the extent of the crisis that is now faced in communities. And it's made me pull back a bit and think, there's just no point in me advocating anymore. We really have to have people from communities advocating, but as you know, they usually won't. But if we don't have the voice and they are not able to advocate for themselves, the media will continue to portray Aboriginal people as, whining, whinging frauds. And that's the main message of the mainstream media now. So do you think I'm wrong?
No, of course not. I look, I don't want to talk about myself, but I come from broken homes and, seen the vicious cycle, and I still see it, right? Families suiciding, families ringing and asking for money and all sorts of things because they just can't meet the, meet the common day bills and things. And we don't need to really get into colour on that, Marcia. We just have to look at the low socioeconomics of people in the same boat, right? But unfortunately, our people dominate this space more than anyone. And so, we've been dispossessed of our lands and it continues on, right? And so, we just have to go out and see the health statistics in communities and we already know what they will tell us, Marcia. And I'm pretty privileged, but I can tell you that I still have family who ain't. And the reality is I'm at a pretty privileged law school, as you know, and I get to interact with some really privileged people, colleagues and students. And the last 5 years I've taught students who've read everything, Marcia. They've read everything, and but the reality is they don't know the realities and the practical experiences of what happens in day to day of people from where we come from. And of late, we've been doing subjects, access to justice on country. We took students up to the Northern Territory, give them the opportunity to engage with Aboriginal organisations, Aboriginal legal services, health services, talk to the Attorney General up there who's Indigenous, talk to the Children's Commissioner who's Indigenous, and really hear the real stories of what's going on in our communities and that. And these students who are going to be the next, Prime Minister or Premier or High Court judges have never seen it or heard this or had these discussions, Marcia, and this is the reality of it. And it's intensified, as you said, from the reality of mainstream media not telling the real stories at the 6 o'clock news and those shows. And unfortunately, that's the only time people actually hear about our people is from those shows. And it's all negative, and the narrative is negative. And even those who lecture some of our subjects or subjects where our people dominate, the narrative is negative. You know, we're troublesome, we're problematic, and it goes on. And as a young student listening to this sort of discussion over the next 3 years, they're going to come out with that mentality as well. So I hear what you're saying, and I totally agree. And like you said, you know, you give up because you're usually one out in these big buildings and trying to educate not only the students but some of your colleagues. And the last 5 years, I think the students are up for it. It's just about them getting the actual information, which is the problem.
I was floored when you chaired our book launch for Law the Way of the Ancestors, the book that Marcia and I wrote for Thames and Hudson this year, in the Melbourne Law School at the University of Melbourne. And, you know, you said to me, or was it the Melbourne Writers Festival gig? Actually, I think it was at the Melbourne Writers Festival gig, which we did together first, when you chaired that for us. You know, I was floored when you said to me, look, there's nothing else like this. And it had never occurred to me that there wouldn't be, because, of course, I'm not a lawyer and I don't teach law. And it had never occurred to me that there is almost no even reading materials available for law students that covers what Indigenous laws actually are, as opposed to, as you were just saying, problematising Aboriginal people within the framework of the Australian legal system.
Yeah, look, I've been employed to do the curriculum change, and look, historically, what would happen would be, here's your readings, and if you got extra time, read these Indigenous authors or articles.
Right.
You know, they weren't prescribed. They were just if you had extra time.
Gotcha.
And you know, a lot of these articles are spot on with not only, say, in the law, but also what's actually happening in our country currently. So, you know, that should be prescribed materials, which we have done now, and give credit to the law school for that. And the feedback from students is that they really appreciate having that understanding of the issues that are facing their First Nations people in this country. So, I mean, there's a slow turnaround, but again, and Marcia would know this better than me, that it then comes back to how you deliver that in the actual subject. And then there's a concern there whether people are really delivering the materials. But, you know, the book that your book and Marcia's book is a real good start of people having a real understanding of the complexities of Indigenous people and our legal systems, right? And it's something that, you know, we're going to try and give to first year students to sort of at least get them to have an understanding that, you know, it isn't all fables and storytelling. It's has real deep meaning, and it has some real scientific facts to it, you know, our legal system and how it's growing into what it is to this day.
Yeah, well, we do spend a lot of time in that book trying to translate quite complex legal concepts that actually do exist in real Australian languages. So, you know, but of course it's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, I even think that, you know, even that, you know, 200 and something page effort is just the beginning. I mean, there isn't even anything as coherent as, for example, a comprehensive legal glossary in any Australian language that I'm aware of. And to me, that would seem like a very obvious starting point. I think it all hinges on really highly trained bicultural translators to pretty much pick up the slack in the court system, from my perspective.
I mean, it's really simple, really, to me, like to introduce students to the likes of someone like Professor Marcia Langton, to hear her talk about the issues that she's done and been involved with, to hear her have that robust discussion with her to really open their minds up around the issues that are facing Indigenous people in this country, and that's what we've been trying to do at the Melbourne Law School. Every subject to really have that I've been teaching is to try and bring in black excellence to really tease out some of these misunderstandings from our students, to really give them the opportunity to meet and understand what our black scholars and lawyers and that are doing, and how they go about doing it.
Yeah.
It's pretty frightening when you meet young students and realise that they've learned almost nothing in their schooling that's accurate about us, and there's not much at university either. And, you know, people like yourself and myself and a few others have our work cut out for us, turning the tide on that deluge of ignorance. You know, I'm often shocked with young students at how many of them simply have no idea about our histories, our cultures, our languages, the closing the gap statistics. And so it's no wonder that, you know, we're seeing the frightful surge of racism in the referendum campaign.
Look, I don't even think we need to go there, Marcia. I mean, we've got pretty privileged people teaching some of their biases in our institutions, right? And it's scary to think, you know, like, again, the Melbourne Law School's had 4 prime ministers come out of it. And, you know what I mean? Like, and if we're not teaching anything around Indigenous, First Nations people and the law in a real sense, why are they then allowed to go out and practice and make decisions and adjudicate on these things? I mean, I went to our IATSIS forum in Queensland a couple of years ago, and 2 former judges on there who presided over land said when they first started, they had no clue. And so they were making decisions on native title, and they're looking back now. I think people are saying those decisions now, they have issues with their own decisions, and they themselves said that even when they left the bench, they struggled to have a real understanding of it all. And so, you know, if we look across from law to the health space, and I'm not saying the health space is, you know, terrific, but if you're going to work in certain areas in Indigenous space and health, you have to have accreditation. But in the law, you can walk out of law school and you can go and practice wherever you like, and you may never even met an Indigenous person in your time.
It's not much different in health, Eddie.
No.
I know, but there are some things there that the law could take some big learnings from.
Well, you know, we have a wonderful Indigenous health workforce, and some services in public health and allied health, and of course, you know, a brilliant body of Aboriginal health workers across the country.
Yep.
And, you know, there are always exceptions in every hospital, but most hospitals don't have training programs. No. Although some are improving. I was at the Melbourne Hospital this week. They've got a great program. You know, I'd hold them up as a model for all hospitals on how to treat First Nations patients. They have a special centre. They have staff, and they are really making a huge effort to ensure that people come in and get treated, continue their treatment, and leave the hospital having been treated well. So, and in a culturally appropriate way. They have terrific Aboriginal staff. So yes, look, I think there are some exceptions in health, but we've got a long way to go, and this is why, you know, we're looking at mortality rates, and I'm sick of saying mortality rates. I want people to understand that people are dropping dead years before their time.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, I agree with you. And like I said, I'm not saying that health is perfect, but I think, Marcia, just on that then, is that close the gap initially gave them the opportunity to have those big debates amongst themselves and with government, and to formulate some better policies. Because initially the justice was left off, closed the gap, and wasn't at the table and didn't have opportunity to question where we're going with this space, and that's probably why it's so drastically in a bad place. And hopefully with it now being included, and look, I don't hold my breath because I continuously see Queensland, who has a Human Rights Act, suspend it so they can change the sentencing and bails acts, as well as allow children to be locked up in police cells as detention centres. So but hoping the ongoing discussion and with government and our organisations at the table might slowly turn that around.
Yeah. So I think we're coming up to time.
Yeah.
And going back to Middle Australia, there are, of course, a whole bunch of really great people out there who are actually going to vote yes in this referendum and need to be supported in that decision, and also in their own personal campaigns to convince other people around them who may be undecided at this point. So my final question is, to people who are genuinely undecided at the moment about how to vote on the 14th of October, Eddie, just to really, really make it simple, what would you say to them, please?
Oh, look, I mean, with Indigenous people are 3% of the population, so we definitely need our friends, right, to make real significant change in this country. And the only way we can do that in regards to this is to people to really get themselves educated, probably turn the TV off and go out and do your own research. At the moment, we're just getting flogged with rhetoric, and I think there are these, for example, the Melbourne Law School students are delivering information sessions. They're neither yes or no supportive. They're just giving information around the issues and the concerns that are facing Indigenous people in this country. And I suggest that people really do their research around the issues and what's happened, in the last few decades in regards to the statistics for Indigenous people. And really, I mean, most non-Indigenous Australians are good people, and I think are fair-minded. But the reality is, we all can be a little bit lazy at times and not do our homework. And I just encourage people to do their homework before they go in and vote on the day.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Eddie.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Been very important.
Yeah. Lovely to talk to you.
Mamak.
Mamak.